the height of the transatlantic slave trade when they were bringing them in by ships. There are an estimated 27 to 30 million slaves in the world today. They just have a new name. It's human trafficking. But it's the same thing, except it's more subtle, it's more underground, it's not open. You're not driving by somebody's house seeing somebody whipping their slaves out of the front yard. But if you're driving by houses in California, they might have an immigrant in their basement. This is real. It is around us. It's just not culturally acceptable the way it was back then. So how do you change it? Because we all recognize that it's wrong, but it's still going on. America puts more money into human trafficking than any other country in the world. So you can't say it's just off in Thailand and these other places. Atlanta is a huge, huge global, international human trafficking spot, I guess you could say. We've got the international airport, so you're taking people in, you're bringing people out. The Super Bowl, large sports events like that, human trafficking is on the rise. You bring people in to sell them. It happens. So this is an aspect of slavery that we're going to be talking about today, with slave narratives. It is a cultural time when slavery was open, it was acceptable, and that was because of race. But slavery itself, all across the board, like human trafficking now, it's not targeted a certain race, it's not targeted a certain gender, it's not targeted a certain age. It's like everybody. And so you can't say it's just prejudice, and if we deal with prejudice, it will deal with slavery. It is sin, and there will always be sin. So if you ask me, what is the solution for slavery? It's not changed laws, it's changed hearts of man. And that only happens through Christ. You can change an action of a culture, but the only real solution is to change the soul, because the problem is so deep. So you can force somebody to not sell somebody else, but you can't change their attitude toward it. And that was the problem when slavery was abolished. It didn't change people's hearts. And so you still had all these problems with prejudice going on. And some of the things people are still saying is, you know, the law got changed, but people didn't change necessarily. So one of the things about abolition is to help people understand what really happened, what was really going on, so that people's minds would change and their hearts would change. So it's not like, oh, it's not that bad, it's not that big of a deal, they're happy the way they are, all that kind of stuff. You even hear that, well, we'll skip that part. But that's important. So when you hear people saying slavery and prejudice, and if we just fix the prejudice, it would fix the problem of slavery, that's not necessarily true. When you hear somebody taking what is a cultural fad thought and throwing it at you, it's always good to back up and say, what is the real question here? Instead of just responding to the argument that's thrown at you, like a literary synthesis, where's your evidence? In the sense, not like, where's your evidence? What is, like, why do you ask that? Why do you think that? Where is that coming from? When somebody says, well, everybody knows evolution is true, and it's like, well, why do you think it's true? The 5 whys is really good. We'll get into that in relational communication. Why do you think it's true? Well, because all the smart people say it's true. Well, why do you think they're smart? Well, because, well, and you ask again and again and again until they finally talk themselves into the real truth is that I don't want a God who tells me what to do. And now you can deal with the problem. It's not out here that's really the problem, it's in here. So when people start throwing something at you, try to get them to actually think, what are they actually asking? What is the real situation? What are we talking about? Are we talking about how you feel about the culture right now? Are we talking about something that happened in the past? Who are you and what's going on in here? Instead of just throwing out rhetoric that you've heard that now you're spitting out because, you know, it's the thing to do right now. Okay, so that being done, setting that aside, let's talk about the actual slave narratives that you're going to be reading. You're going to like Frederick Douglass, I think. You're going to have 2 of them to read, and your journal and your thread of discussion are going to be based on the things you're reading this week. I really think, not that you're going to enjoy it in the sense of like this is fun, but this is worth digging into. It's worth studying, and it's really good stuff.
As sad as it is fun to read compared to Emerson and Thoreau. Emerson and Thoreau, reading them is like, yeah.
I'll give you that.
Reading them is like eating, I don't know.
Brussels sprouts?
But I was actually Brussels sprouts.
Why don't you like Brussels sprouts?
I don't know if that's the best example, but yes.
Okay, so this genre, now see, they're talking about it as a genre, and that's, in and of itself, I'm like, it's not just this literary fad. I mean, these are people, and this is really what's happening with these people. So it's beyond a genre, in my opinion, but we are talking about a time frame, and so I understand. Okay, so these are stories that are narratives going on during the 18th and 19th centuries when slavery was rampant, and they were bringing them over by ships. So you had slave ships that were just full of people in chains, stuffed into little pockets. Sometimes they would have a, what they call him, the slave boy. Somebody might get shanghaied on their ship, so maybe you get stolen, trafficked, and your job every day is to play the flute, and they bring all the people up and make them dance so that they exercise, so that they're less likely to die. If a police ship, or whatever you want to call it, the law, started catching one of these slave ships after, you know, it was a problem, sometimes they might just throw them all overboard so that they didn't get caught. It was horrific. It was a terrible time. They're often written by people who endured the struggles themselves. That's always good to find out firsthand instead of what so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so said. But were sometimes written by others through dictation and word of mouth. Now, why might somebody need to write a dictation from a slave?
Couldn't always read and write.
Instead of them writing itself? Yes. They were not legally allowed to read and write for a time. And that was very significant. Why do you think they wouldn't let them read and write?
If you can't write, you can't learn. If you can't learn, don't stay for us.
Yes. You can keep a person's mind contained if you don't let them learn anything beyond where they are. So, in reference to that, if you were writing about this, this would be one of your evidences.
Real quick,
Mhm.
I have a question. So, in Frederick Douglass's autobiography, he talks about how, so he learned how to read, and then he learned how to write. And what I was slightly confused by was he was talking about how, like, he would look at letters, like, on these, like, boxes and boards and stuff to learn how to write, and he would copy them down. But I'm like, well, if he knows how to read, he already knows what the letters look like, I would think. So I guess I'm just kind of confused. So what is the difference between learning how to read and learning how to write?
Well, I would say it's a lot different, like, than somebody who is growing up in a bilingual family, and they're like, I totally understand Spanish, but I can't speak it. It's just another skill. So, like, you learn how to read what you see, but then to actually get your fingers to do this is difficult.
Okay.
It's like the difference between, like, print and cursive. I knew how to write in print, but I didn't know how to write in cursive. You're like, well, you know all the letters, but it's just, you know, that's harder.
Okay, I see.
Learning how to like read is a bunch of context. You see certain words and the context put together. You know what that means.
I can read
But you
cursive,
won't
I
have
can't
enough
write
knowledge
it
of
to
the
save my
context
life.
to
Really?
figure it all out.
Well, there you go.
That makes sense.
Avery,
I
Frederick
had tried
Douglass.
writing cursive, it's impossible for me. So.
And that's actually interesting. My kids learned in, like, kindergarten. If you learn in kindergarten, it's kind of like if you learn a language before you're 5, it's easy. And after a certain age, your mouth develops, and there are certain sounds you literally can't make. I find that so interesting. But for kids, little tiny kids, cursive is easier because it's hard to write straight lines. So teaching kids cursive in kindergarten makes more sense than print. It's just an argument, and it makes them look really smart when your 5-year-old is like, ooh.
My oldest sister can only write in cursive,
Really?
which she has a slight mental disability, so it's like, it's really
It's
interesting.
connected.
Because she writes really good cursive, but when
That-
she tries to print,
That makes sense to me. I hate straight lines. I hate them. Okay, I want you to listen to this. This was a slave. She goes under the umbrella of it wasn't so bad, maybe. I want you to listen to the things she says. Think of them in reference to if you don't let a person learn to read and write. This mindset, where does this mindset come from? And we got to talk about it later, but I want you to listen first. 3
I
minutes.
can remember when the Yankees come through, and they carried my father away, and carried was 2 sisters and 1 brother. And they left me, and I can remember when my mistress used to run in the garden upon the Yankees and tell us if they come, don't tell them where they're at. Don't tell nobody where they're at when they come. And they all come on and told me, don't get scared now and tell them where they is. I told them no. We told them no. And when they come and ask for them, I told them I didn't know where they was. They was in the woods. And that was at the house. And my father, when my father left, he went away with the Yankees and carried two girls and 1 son, the oldest one. Carried them with him. And they beat the Yankees. And I can remember that. And my old missus was named Miss M. And the master was named Mr. Frank Irving. Mr. Frank Irving.
They treat you pretty good?
Yes, sir, they treat me nice. They treat me nice as they could treat me. And then after they left, after they died, then I was still here, and I'm here until yet. And the white folks all been treating me mighty nice ever since it knows me. They treat me on now. It knows me, they treat me nice. I came up over here from Mr. Young, to come over to Fulton, Auburn, and come to Mr. Young's place up here. And he kept me there until he died, him and his wife. And then I come on in from that, on down here, and I'm here yet. And they all treat me nice. All the white folks that know me, they treat me nice. And if I want anything, I'll ask for it. I was taught it that way by my old master. Don't steal, don't lie. And if you want anything, ask for it. Be honest in what you get. That's what I was raised up with. And I'm there to be today.
What's the government been doing for you?
They've been treating me fine. Ever since I've been here.
Okay, we'll stop there. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting. So Frederick Douglass talked about how there was a big difference between how slaves were treated in the city and how they were treated on plantations, because there was a lot more accountability in the city.
Okay.
So I think it's just interesting. You can't really. It was varied, probably. There were lots of slave masters who were evil, and then there were some who were not. And so, really, it's kind of a complex thing. People are different, and you can't necessarily generalize an entire people group and say, oh well, all of them were evil. I guess in that way, it's kind of a little different from human trafficking of today, in the sense that there were people who weren't evil, who owned slaves.
And I guess that would bring up the question of, is it evil to own another human being?
Well,
It
yes,
is,
I guess
but
what I mean
there's
is
a
though
cultural aspect of it, you know?
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is not that they don't do anything evil, but it's not, owning a slave and treating it well is not is not the same thing as owning a slave and mistreating them. So there were there were a lot of slave owners who were just pure evil, and then there were some who were participating in a cultural sin, but weren't necessarily, but weren't evil people.
I think about it like alcohol. A bunch of people, right now it's culturally accepted to drink alcohol. And so some people, I know some really nice people that drink a lot of alcohol, but they're super nice people to, obviously have some moral holes in their moral, what they believe, but there's really nice people. They're not evil people at all. What they're doing is evil, but they're not an evil mentality. So where do you draw the line at what's evil? What's your definition of evil?
Do they get drunk?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Yes. Because it's culturally accepted.
Yeah.
That's
I've
what
heard
you
the
do
same
for fun.
argument in the sense, well, you could say the same argument about abortionists. There are
Yeah.
abortionists who are really nice people. And that's something we could talk about, the philosophy of it and the morality of it a lot. When it comes down to it, people need the Lord. The slavers need the Lord. The slaves themselves need the Lord. There were really bad slaves who were unkind to other slaves. So the concept of just because you are in this position or just because you're in this position does not make you good or bad. The sinfulness of humanity itself is important. One thing that brings to mind, prejudice, again, is not the same as slavery. So not all oppressors and victims it's hard to define. In the book Gone with the Wind, the thing that surprised me, I started reading it. I've seen the movie like a billion times. My mom liked to watch it like every year. And right now it's a big thing because of cancel culture. We should not watch this because it presents slaves as stupid and happy, like cows. You know, they were just fine with the way things were, and they didn't care. And what would they do if they were free anyway, etc. So I started reading the book. I was pretty shocked about the book. Now, it was written in the 30s by a woman in Atlanta. Her house is still there, right near the Federal Reserve. You can go and see it. She like broke her ankle or something, and she was laid up, and so she wrote it. She didn't expect it to be famous, and it was like went everywhere. But her perspectives are so Old South. Like, she doesn't even present it as this is my perspective. She like doesn't seem to understand that there is any other perspective. So it is about as good of a representation of the way people thought during the Civil War as you can get. Because she presents things kind of like, well, everybody knows a black person will steal from you if they get the chance. I mean, just like throws that out there, not even like I think or some people think or whatever. It's just part of the story, as in, yeah, of course, like duh. And so one of the things when the Yankees came in, the idea of a free black person was just hateful, horrible. They're going to take advantage of us, they're going to do whatever. But one thing I found really interesting that you don't hear very much was there were levels of prejudice. The whole society is based on prejudice. When you watch Old English stuff, you've got the rich people and you've got the common masses. That's it in many, many places in the world. You've got the aristocracy, and then you got the people. You know, like the French. You've got these people, and you got all these common, dirty, down there people. And it's okay to feel like they're gross and lesser because they are. You know, that's kind of the idea. And so that's one of the reasons Charles Dickens wrote to all these people to say, here's what it's really like. These are just people. You know, America wasn't based that way. But America wasn't based on the them and them based on money or based on education. That was the American dream, was that it didn't matter where you were in this line. You could go up if you worked hard enough, except in reference to race. So American slavery, prejudice, whatever, is very much based on this hatred of other people. So race in the cities, it was the Irish. The Irish immigrants are going to come and take our jobs. It was the Chinese. It was, now there's the issue with the Latinos. They're going to come and take all the cheap jobs, and they're going to take my job, and blah, 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 blah. It's still there. It hasn't changed. There was definitely the black people. So prejudice against a race is still alive and kicking now. Even if it's not culturally acceptable, that doesn't mean that people aren't thinking certain things, doing certain things. We have this human gut reaction to someone who is different. We feel threatened by them. I mean, imagine if somebody walked in with a mohawk and a loincloth and war paint on with a big old spear. Your first reaction wouldn't be like, hey, welcome, we're so glad you're here. It'd be like, what are you doing here? If somebody walked in a big old turban onto your airplane in 2001, December, your first thought is, are you a threat to me? Long story, I actually dressed up in my Muslim outfit one time and went out and did an experiment on it because I wanted to see if Christians would treat me any differently than regular people. It was very, very interesting. If you want to know what happened, I can send you the article about it. It was very, very fascinating. But anyway.
You know, in reference to the difference between it and abortion, I think that, I think that slavery is a more complex issue because, so for example, abortion is killing another human being. Slavery is owning another human being. And I think that with slavery, there's more of a range from, absolutely terrible to bad, but not as terrible.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Whereas with abortion, it's kind of just, well, you're killing a baby.
That's true.
The only gray area with abortion is people who don't understand that it is killing.
Right. That's true.
And so there is
a difference between the two. Yeah, definitely.
So for example, like Jonathan Edwards owns some slaves, but he is that doesn't mean we shouldn't listen to what he says. He has a lot of great things to say. He's a very wise person. That doesn't mean he didn't have moral blind spots or things where just he accepted the cultural idea of what was acceptable.
Yes.
And so then
Ravi
also,
Zacharias.
Yeah.
Because what has come out does not mean we should not listen and admire the things that he did for the Lord. But unfortunately, our actions damage our testimony. Yeah. And so one thing with cancel culture, when people start saying, we should not admiring the founding fathers because they owned slaves. Again, backing up to why are we asking this question? What's really going on? And no one belongs on the pedestal except for Christ. Nobody. So we shouldn't be surprised when they fall off the pedestal, because we shouldn't have put them up there in the first place. But yes, you don't negate what someone does do because of what they did. I mean, King David. What if King David came in your church and God was like, here's my testimony. First, I had an affair, and then I murdered the guy, and then whatever. But God says I'm a man after God's own heart. We'd be like, you're out of here. Sorry. Yes, Brian.
What came out about Bobby?
You can look him up. But after he died, some allegations came out, which we were like, no. But they started doing an investigation, and they found out that they're probably true. So he had some morality stuff, which is really, 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 really sad. Because if there was ever a person I wanted to put up on the pedestal, it would have been him, ever. And it's a very difficult thing when you get disillusioned about your heroes. But the reminder about it again and again and again is that nobody belongs up there but Christ. Nobody.
I haven't looked into it that much. Are the allegations of things that happened like a long time ago or recent?
Over a span of years.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately. So, not like the Hillsong dude, but what? Lesser.
I mean,
We won't need to go there. I don't want to give you all those details. Okay.
You can just tell. You
can't just
you
do
know
that.
anything about him. You're like, there's
Look at
something
my-
not right there. He was kind of like from the beginning,
Yes,
like
exactly. So it's not that.
He seems morally upright.
Yes.
He says a lot of good things.
Exactly. And so, again, you don't negate what he did because of the fact that he was a sinner. But I also, to me, it is a huge reminder to all of us, don't have secret sins. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And the one thing about David that was different about him, I think why God called him a man after God's own heart, was not that he never did anything wrong, but that when he was confronted with it, he repented. And he went back to God. And so God was able to get glory from that. Whereas if you hide it and you deny it, you have given the enemies of God cause to blaspheme, and you have never dealt with it. And that's just, if you ever want to ruin your ministry, that's the way to do it. So don't do it. Don't
Which is when
hide.
people say, well, Trump did bad things, but David did bad things too. I'm like, well, Trump hasn't repented. He specifically said, like, people asked him, like, hey, have you repented of your sins? And he was like, I don't think I have any sins to repent of. I'm like, well, then you're not
That's a
saved.
sin right there.
Okay.
Saying you
That's
don't have
a
sin.
sin.
You're not saved if you don't think that
My greatest quality is my extensive and awesome humility. Okay, so back to the slave narratives. And if you want to study that, there's plenty to study, but you can just leave it at that. If people found out he was a sinner, and it makes me sad. All right, your journal entry and your threaded discussion are both based on this concept, and I wanted to bring them up because again, she's using these mega words. Your journal entry, what is the link between literacy and identity formation? She loves that. In the lives of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs. Please offer clear evidence from the assigned chapters to support an incisive thesis. Woo! Yeah.
One thing that stood out to me was when, what's her name, Harriet Jacobs was that?
Mhm.
You could tell that she was the one that learned how to read, and obviously she wrote the book, so she, that was one thing, but her speech was a little more proper and intelligent than how she displayed the other slaves,
Okay, that's very important. And in fact, your journal, you just said it.
I was wondering,
run
did
with
she from the
that.
beginning, did she speak better, or like more clearly, more like white people, I guess, or did she just in retrospect?
Now that's a very interesting thing that you just said. More like white people. That was the problem with the
It's
preconceived
exactly, it's not-
notion
yeah, it's
was
betterness.
black people are like this and we're like this. So they didn't think of it as less educated and more educated. It was like you're talking like a white person. That's very interesting. The mental concepts, what we're talking about this week is identity formation. How is who they are and how they, not just how they present themselves to the world, but how they think about themselves different because they learn to read and write. So for example, one of Harriet Jacobs in her story, that's why these are up here. Here's the way she says something, and here's the way the other slave says something. So I'm just going to read it out loud. So Sally, they're going to carry my children to the plantation tomorrow, and they will never sell them to anybody so long as they have me in their power. Now, would you advise me to go back? Now that's like an educated, expressed person, and skipping all the horrors of what she's talking about, just looking at the aspect of it. Okay, and here's the response. No, child, no. When they finds you's gone, they won't want a plague of the children. But where's you gonna hide? They knows every inch of this house. If you want to be an abolitionist, if you want to change the mindset of the educated people, you gonna be able to do it if you talk like this? I hate saying that because it's not a reference to prejudice, it's a reference of what it represents. So for example, you go to an interview because you want to get a really good job. They have a job opening for a janitor, and they have a job opening for a PR person, public relations. So you're talking to all their clientele. And you go in and you're like, hey there, I talked to them there people down there, and they say come tell you what I want to do here. I want to get me a job and earn some monies because I want to be rich because nobody in my family's rich. Can I have a job? Which job are you going to give them? The PR job, talking to the clientele, or are you going to give them the janitor job? And that's not a sense of prejudice, that's a sense of education and skill sets and ability to communicate and etc. So if you keep your people, whatever group that you're trying to control, if you keep them uneducated, in essence, in many, many, many ways, you keep them powerless. They're not going to rise up if they have no power, and they're not going to have power if they don't think for themselves. Voila. I lived in a culture that was like that. You aren't supposed to think, you're supposed to conform. And even in school, the way school worked was you memorize it and you repeat it back to me. So you learn the right answers, you give me the right answers, that's it. And so it took us about 3 years. For starters, our little kids, if you lifted up a pointer, you might get a flinch because they were afraid you're going to hit them with it. It's very sad. But after they got used to us, I would present a story, and if you said, so what would you do if you were the person in the story? And you see all these looks of fear, just like, I don't know the right answer, I don't know the right answer, I don't know what I'm supposed to say. And it took years to get them to understand what I want is for you to think for yourself and tell me what's in your head, not just what you memorized. So we actually had an issue with Awana, because we had Awana out there for the kids who were allowed to come, and they would memorize tons and tons of verses, but it never connected with, I should think about this verse and what it might mean and what it means to me. And so I ended up writing a curriculum of Bible stories because they could memorize and repeat like crazy, but we needed to make the connection to this is for you. This isn't just, wow, it was crazy. The difference between education, even the education that they were getting and the education that they could get, it changed things. It really did. So thinking about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, how did their own identity to the world, for example, as an abolitionist going around and speaking, how did that change, or how did their abilities change, how did the way people see them change because they knew how to read and write, as opposed to if they had not? Your thoughts?
They were probably more respected and looked at, not as a slave, but more of a human.
Like, oh, you're a human being. Yeah.
Like, oh, you can actually, think for yourself.
You can think for yourself. You could, if somebody gave you freedom, you might actually want it. Yeah, there's something about coming up to another person's level that makes them actually see you as a real person.
You're able to learn, it's not it's not just, oh, you have this limitation on your abilities, but, oh, if we actually give them the opportunity, then they can be citizens just like anybody else.
And we all have it, kind of in the sense of refugees. If 1 million refugees come into the country, you see them, they're dirty, they're hungry, they're all in these big clumps, they're living out on the streets, and you just have this concept of them, even if you try not to, and you have this sense of compassion toward them because they're these needy poor people, right? And then you go to talk to them and you meet this guy, and he's like, I'm a university professor. My school got bombed out. My family got taken or something, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We came here with nothing because I lost everything. And all of a sudden, doesn't your mind change about this person? They're not just this poor, helpless person that I need to help. Suddenly, they're like a real person with a real life, and you start thinking of it in reference to yourself, suddenly. Instead of just them, us, it's like, what would I do if that happened to me? How would I feel if that happened to me? I had to grab my kids and run for it. I met with this book club once of these old ladies, and we were in Lenore, North Carolina, and you think of, literally old, they were really old. And you think, they probably lived in a picket fence house their whole life and never went anywhere. Sweet little, oh, that's nice, and I had this idea in my head, and I didn't think of it in a sense of I was stereotyping them, But they started talking and telling their stories, and the one she was like, I have this memory from when I was little. I think she was from, maybe it was Russia, one of those Soviet Union countries. She's like, I remember holding on the hand of my aunt, and we were running for the train, and they were shooting behind us, and the train started moving, and it was like, you know, I guess if we missed the train, we're done. And we were running, she was a little tiny kid. She was like, I remember the bombs, I remember hiding in the basement. And I'm just like, oh my word. Changed the way I thought about her. I met another one she was probably 80 years old, and she was like, she was in the CIA during the war or something. I was like, can I follow you home and hear your stories? You know, and all of a sudden it was like person, not just sweet little white-haired lady that you kind of pat on the head and say, oh, that's nice, you know. It's like, wow, you're like this amazing person. I want to know more about you. In the movie Amazing Grace, there is a slave who's very well-spoken, and he writes a book, and it goes crazy like wildfire. Now, why would people be interested in a book that he wrote during the abolitionist phase, that you would call it, I guess? Why would they want to know his book instead of William Wilberforce's, per se?
Proof that they're intelligent.
Okay.
It can be an intelligent link.
Ooh, a link. I like that. An intelligent link to a people that, what was the stereotype at the time about slaves and their intelligence?
They're animals, basically.
So if you think this group of people is animals and therefore it's okay to treat them like animals, and then suddenly you meet somebody who's very well spoken, who's very well educated, who can talk about things well, express themselves well, suddenly you can't define them that way anymore. So one of your threaded discussion, how do Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs undermine stereotypical conceptions of slaves in the assigned narratives? So they're talking about, you know, what is the stereotype? They can't think for themselves. They're just animals. They need our help to take care of them, and it doesn't really matter. They don't, you know, they don't mind. They're happy the way they are. Why anybody would think that, I don't even know. It's so dumb. But to change things, you have to understand the way people think to help change their mind. So you can't just be like, well, y'all are stupid. That's not going to change anything. So having a slave narrative is authentic. Suddenly it's like, oh, they actually know. They've actually experienced this. So you've got, you know, think about these like educated rich people sitting around talking about slavery, but they have no real life connection to it.
Which is why I would much rather read these, Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass, than Uncle Tom's Cabin. Because Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by a white woman in the North who hadn't even ever been to the South. And if you read, yeah, and so it was very influential on abolitionism, but she actually didn't know, like she didn't have firsthand experience of what she was talking about. So this is much more factual and actually getting at what it actually would have been like.
Yeah, it's less arguable. Like you could argue against Uncle Tom's Cabin and say, well, I'm not gonna act upon what she's saying because what does she really know? Whereas you can't say Frederick Douglass doesn't know. And so that lends power to it. Yeah.
I don't know if this relates or not. I just thought it was really interesting. One of Harriet Jacobs, like at the first part of one of the chapters, she was like, I would rather be working out in the field with a slave driver on my back than be like the house servant or something like that, because of the actual people relations you have to do. Because on a plantation, you got your work, you're doing the work, you go home, that's your life. But with that, it was just talking about how the jealous wife and then the husband that has no morals, just the relation that's there. It's much more deep than just you got whipped. That was not the single problem. It was a mental aspect.
It was mental and psychological, and because she thought about it, she made that choice. Whereas, that's very interesting that you brought that up, because when I was talking about Gone with the Wind, the thing I was going to get to and I forgot, was these levels of prejudice. What you see very, very clearly in the novel is that the slaves had their sense of prejudice as well. You had the house servants, which were up here. They were usually more refined. They spoke better, et cetera, and then it went down in levels and down and down and down and down and down to the field hands, the one she's talking about. The field hands were the lowest of the low. So if you didn't have any skills and you didn't have whatever, you go pick cotton 12 hours a day. Your kids pick cotton 12 hours a day. Like everybody picks cotton 12 hours a day in the sun, in the rain, in the whatever, and that's your world. And so the house servants would be prejudiced against the field hands. And interestingly enough, in the story, there was also the white trash, who were the white people who were low class and embarrassed the other white people. And the house servants actually would talk badly about the white trash. And the white trash hated it that there were black people who looked down on them. How dare they? So everybody's like, prejudice against, I mean, it was just like crazy. This system of worth and value identity based on all kinds of things. It wasn't just race. It was levels of employment, in a sense, your level of slavery. And interestingly enough, after the war, when Scarlett, if you don't know the story, it's about this one family that goes through war, basically. And there's this one super strong-willed girl who, like, fights through it, and that's the reason she's likable. Other than that, she's pretty much not. She's manipulative, selfish, crabby, and she uses other people.
What is it we're talking about?
Gone with the Wind.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. So that's about Scarlett. But the thing about her is she's strong. I think she kind of represents, in a sense, the South itself. They were very proud. When the war came, they were like, everybody knows one Southerner can lick 10 Yankees. And they really thought that. The war was going to be over in 3 months because the Yankees are losers and we're tough. And yay, didn't happen. But they were very proud of themselves, in a sense, and of their culture. So here's Scarlett and the people around her, particularly the women who are supposed to be very frail and very sweet and swoon on a regular basis, which makes sense because they were wearing corsets and they couldn't breathe very well. So anytime something exciting happens, it's like, like the dog, you know. But anyway, so you took around your smelling salts to wake yourself up, and interesting stuff. But Scarlett was this hardcore, I'm gonna survive, I don't care what it takes, and she basically saves her whole entire family and other people. So that's admirable about her. But after the war, okay, all these gorgeous plantations of all these super rich people, they're bombed out and destroyed. Her house wasn't destroyed, but the Yankees came and took everything, like everything. And all the slaves ran away, except for like the 2 house slaves. I think that was it. And the interesting thing was, she forced her sisters and herself to go out and pick cotton themselves. So here's the super rich woman who's lowered to a field hand, but the house slaves wouldn't do it because that was too low for them. I just thought that was so interesting that here's Scarlett going and doing what their slaves would not do because it was too demeaning and helpless. So that was interesting. It presented these slaves in the story as ignorant in the sense of they never made their own decisions, and so they were completely helpless. After the war happened, they were kind of like, Miss Scarlett, what we gonna do? Because there ain't no food. Miss Scarlett, what we gonna do? Because so-and-so's up sick up there, and I ain't got nothing to give them. What we gonna do with this here cow? Because we ain't got nobody to place it because the Yankee took everything. La, 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 Miss Scarlett, Miss Scarlett. So she's like super stressed out. She's like 18, and the whole world is like counting on her because her dad went crazy and her mom died, and it's just like, whoa! Okay? But, so you're like, oh, the slaves, they're ignorant. Who made them ignorant?
I think people look at things like that and they're like, oh, well, it's making the slaves apt to be ignorant. I'm like, well, you have to think about it in context of not that they have to be ignorant, but that they've been made ignorant, they've been made to be dependent, and they've been trained all their life to act like children dependent on their masters.
Exactly, and if you've been trained to think a certain way, it's not necessarily your fault that you don't. People like Frederick Douglass were the type that were like, no, and they went above it. But the types that aren't the type to be like that are the accepting types, like that nice lady. They treated me as well as they could. Now, you know that means something. It wasn't just they treated me well. She mentioned they treated me as well as they could, those white folks. There's a lot in there that she just accepted and accepted and accepted. That's one of the things when we do training on human trafficking. One of the definitions is force, fraud, or coercion. And a lot of the grooming for trafficking is not, you don't have change, you don't have people grabbing you at the mall and putting you in a van. That's only like 10%. Most of it is psychological manipulation. You are grooming someone's mind. You're grooming them on the internet. So if you guys get those messages from random guys who are like, I saw your profile, and I think you're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and I want to talk to you, and la la la, turn them off, turn them off, turn them off, turn them off.
That's why I do not have like a close picture of myself on Instagram.
Especially if they're...
I get a call from any stranger and I answer it just to... There's something satisfying about someone talking to me and me irritating them. It's just that guy who intentionally, he called me to irritate me, but I have successfully irritated him.
To irritate the king from India that wants to give you his bank account is so fun.
James Gooch right here.
Hate it.
My mom got cussed out one time for doing that. She was.
See, if I get cussed out though, it's like, yes, that's a broken man right there.
I need to hire you guys. I'm not sure what for, but I need to hire you. So, to do my human trafficking training. Okay, this is what you do. Okay. But the thing is, okay, so here's some 12-year-old girl. Her parents work a lot. She's lonely. She wishes she had somebody who cared about her. She gets on the internet because that's what she does. That's where she's looking for love. Some dumb message like this comes up. She's too young to have red flags because nobody ever taught her about that. And so this guy trains her, manipulates her, psychologically gets her to reject all of her sources of emotional whatever. Your parents don't understand you. Nobody loves you like I love you. Nobody's going to help you but me, etc., etc., etc. If you run away, I'll give you whatever you need. I'll take care of you, la, 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 la. He's feeding her everything she wants. He's getting her to reject everything she's actually getting so that he is her only source. And she genuinely believes this is the only person who loves me, this is the only person who's going to help me, so that by the time he actually says, let's meet up, and she gets trafficked, he doesn't need James. Because he's got her mind, and he's got her heart. So there are legitimate girls who've been rescued from trafficking, who after a time want to go back to their trafficker. Yeah, he beats me, he sells me, he does all these things, but he's the only person who loves me. It's horrible. And so again, the solution is not just, let's change the laws. Let's set these kids free. Let's do this. There's so much in their heads that needs to change. So the people who brought up, what are we going to do if we set all the slaves free? There is some legitimate to that argument, because if you've trained them to be like this, what are they going to do with freedom? Not all the slaves were like Frederick Douglass that was like, I'm going to rise above this. Some of them were accepting and were like, okay, this is what it is. And now they're free. What are they going to do?
Was probably a mistake, because we ended it like boom, and we're not going to help the slaves. We're not going to figure out anything to do to help these people. We're just going to like say, you're on your own now.
And that's worse than, because it's like there's an economic problem right there. If you have a bunch of people flooding in, it's like, okay, good luck.
And that's one of the things, like when human trafficking became a big subject and people really cared. It's like rescue, 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 and there's the problem of, okay, so you rescue some little child who stopped emotionally developing at 12, because that's when she got trafficked, and now she's 16. She doesn't even know how to go check her mail because she's been kept in a basement for 5 years. Mentally, she's still 12 years old. And you're like, I got you out of the basement. Have a nice life. You're free. Yay for me. I'm going to go talk about it on social media and say I'm so awesome. And this poor child is devastated and left. So it's not that you shouldn't have rescued her, but there is more that you should have done as a moral, godly person who cares about this person, not just caring about rescue. So it is significant, it's genuine. That's why I believe when there is a great social change, the Christians need to rise up. That's why a lot of people, like with the abortion argument, well, who are you to say we should stop, abortion, because what are you going to do with all those babies? How many babies have you taken in? And it's like, okay, the Christians rise up, and I have seen literal posts of people saying, if you're considering this, I'll take your baby, I'll take them. Sometimes that's what a person needs to hear, instead of just, you're a jerk, you did the wrong thing, la 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 la, you're bad, 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 bad. They're like, what am I supposed to do? You didn't give them an option, you didn't give them a solution. It's like, I will take your child. I will take every single one of them. And that requires much more than just caring about the problem or hating the problem. It's, okay, here's Christ. Here's how Christ would respond to this. In Rome, there was a lot of, I guess you call it infanticide. If they had unwanted babies, they would leave them on the steps of the temple to die. It's horrible and very, very sad. The Christians, the first century believers, would go to the temple and take the babies. And it was this very clear and obvious countercultural, nobody was shouting about it and saying we're so much better than everybody else because we're doing this. It was very quiet. I'm going to do the right thing. And so that's the real question, is not what do you talk about, what do you do? What do we do when we're faced with it?
Well, the problem is when Christianity it stops being countercultural and it starts being cultural.
Now there's something you could write a paper about.
In the South, Frederick Douglass talks about how actually the worst slave masters were the ones who were the most professing to be Christians. And
Don't take that
it wasn't
real.
real.
That's my prompt for my paper. So.
Oh.
and it wasn't real Christianity. It was this kind of fake, skin deep Christianity of wanting to be socially acceptable, and that was the social thing. There's much about religion that can be misused for those who want power. In many religions, pretty much all religions, you can use people's desire for faith against them, and you can use belief as a whip, if you wish.
I've been looking at a lot of stuff like that. It's interesting because it's like that's what people do today too, as well as they view Christianity as rules and not a relationship. And so that's what it was back then. They used the rules of it to hold those people in precedence, not the relationship. Because it's like, if you were a Christian, you'd have a relationship with Jesus. If you had a relationship with Jesus, you would not want to hold another one of his children down.
And that brings up an excellent point. Pharisees, Sadducees, that's what they were all about. And if you read about Christ, so often people threw political, cultural statements, rhetoric at him. What should we do about taxes? Should we pay for Caesar? They wanted the Messiah to come to get them out from under oppression. Because they were legitimately oppressed as a culture. They wanted a government to rescue them. So they're like, hey, Jesus, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? So in other words, are you a rebel? Or are you are you a Tory? Or are you a American freedomist? Where's your alliances? Where's your loyalty? Whenever he was asked a political question, as far as I know, I never found one that he directly answered in the sense of the hot topic. He never addressed a hot topic. He went to the heart of the matter. Or he just said something that basically said, this is irrelevant. Let's go to what's important. And so again, you're getting back to the soul of it rather than the issue that's right now. What is the eternal issue here? What's really going on? So yeah, the people who are using religion as a whip or as a whatever, Jesus said all of the law and the prophets can be under two things. Love God with all your heart and your soul and your mind and your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those two things, if people would follow them, all of this would be solved. Every bit of it.
Another thing that was interesting is the way that they combined like brutal oppression and then also like licentiousness as a means of keeping them down. So as in they told them they were like, here at Christmas time you can do anything you want basically, but what they were trying to do is teach them they weren't giving them liberty, they were giving them licentiousness, which licentiousness is just like
another form of slavery.
Yeah.
Like getting somebody drunk so that you can, that's very true. It's that's why drugs are very much a part of trafficking now.
And it's
if somebody hooks on drugs, they'll do whatever you want.
It's kind of like, so there's two dystopian novels. There's 1984 by George Orwell.
Yeah.
That's the one a lot of people know about. Then there's also Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. And 1984 is like this really oppressive government is always watching you, is going to torture you if you don't do what they say. And then Brave New World is this government that's like, here, have all the drugs you want, have all the entertainment you want, and
bread and
that's how they keep them
circuses,
down.
which was the phrase in Rome. If you can give them bread and circuses, you can keep them under your control, which Rome did. Give them all the entertainment, give them the bloodthirstiness, etc. And interesting, the bread and circuses, the word is panem, which you might have heard from the Hunger Games. Oh, yeah, bread and circuses. If you can keep them entertained, you can keep them. All right, we were supposed to watch 2 videos. I've kind of given up on the idea of us actually getting our videos watched because I'd rather talk with y'all and you can watch videos on your own. Do you actually watch the videos?
I don't find the study.com videos very helpful, honestly. I don't know if that's just me.
But the past couple classes I've not watched the videos just because they're not helpful.
Yeah.
But Darth Vader shows up every once in a while.
Talk to somebody about this.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay,
the
that's good to know
lectures-
because I feel that way, but I
You might
just,
wanna-
The lectures cover, I think, a lot of
and it's like the videos you can watch on your own. We can't talk together while you're at home. So,
Alright.
last things, you have an English 243 classroom on study.com which contains summaries analysis that you love so much. On most all of the stories you're journaling about. So again, if you're like, what's the theme, what's the whatever, that is a good place to find things. There's a link, okay, if you haven't been able to watch some of these, there's a link to join the classroom. If you join the classroom, then you should be able to get all these things that, get linked to you. Whitetail Romance, finish it up, because you're going to have to journal about it. Last question. These slave narratives, how do they fit or not fit, prove or not prove that knowledge is power?
Independence, because knowledge is thinking for yourself, and thinking for yourself is independence. Independence comes power.
Okay. When I was in Bangladesh, I had a friend, sweet lady. She broke bricks on the side of the road. They were everywhere. There were beggars everywhere too. So she actually had a job. But her job was to take bricks and a hammer, like a mallet, and bonk them all day long to make gravel out of the bricks. Long story, why they did that. But there were people on the side of the road, pretty much everybody went, bong, 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 over and over again. I don't know how they stood it. Her kids stayed with her, Milo and Reuben, and then she had Shuni. She made about 50 cents a day. So her kids, what chance would they ever have to go to school? So they hung out on the side of the road with her. That's what they did. That was their life. Is anything going to change for those kids? When they grow up, what are they going to do? Probably the same thing. But if you could give those kids an education, teach them to read, teach them to write, teach them to think, how might that change their future? We have kids in our school that are now at Harvard, Yale. One of them's going to be a neurological surgeon. Wow, I taught that kid the Fuji lip song. Knowledge, like you said, it changes the way you think, and the way you think changes the way you act, and the way you act can change the world. But if you're stuck on the side of the road all day long breaking bricks, when are you ever going to get the idea that let me analyze the society around me and decide if it's good or not? If you don't, you might have the French Revolution, where the masses of common people decide this is wrong, so let's go cut off everybody's heads. But that's not necessarily a good solution. And the best thing of all, teach them the scriptures. And it's not like it's not still happening. We've got a girl with Source of Light. It was one of the African countries. There was a war, and the adults just left. I can't even fathom this. They left. They left the kids behind. I don't know if the kids weren't in danger or if they just left because they were scared. So here's all these kids with no adults, no whatever, no education, school's done. There's no teachers. But she had some Source of Light lessons. That was the only thing she had. And that's what she learned and studied and learned and studied and learned and studied. And now she's grown up to be, she wrote a biology textbook, and she's going to be a teacher person, whatever. And she's very well educated, and because she had something to read. It makes a difference. You guys are wealthy beyond what you can possibly imagine. The fact that you have access to things to read, that you have the scriptures. You should turn your phone off if you're ever teaching a class, because it's embarrassing when people call you. You want to talk to him, Avery?
Sell them something.
It's probably my doctor. If you make them cuss you out, then I'm going to be mad. All right. You didn't want that stupid MRI. You're supposed to get an MRI. What's wrong with you? Okay. Good talk. Keep your brain on. Write some of your literary sentences. I would love to read it if you want to bring it, and send me your grades today,
I have
please.
plans. I just got it this week. If it makes you feel better.
That makes me feel better.
Right.
Thank you.
I have an idea.
What's your idea?
I haven't had time to look at
Let's
it.
go with those.
I think
Do they have to be grades for dispatch?
the woman in the 19th century.
Can I
I
give
kind of
y'all
want to
some math
compare
tips?
her view of marriage with.
Do y'all like math?
I would love to read that. I'm so impressed when you guys analyze stuff. I really am. I'm like, wow, there's so much
I
stuff
really
there.
wish I could just turn in my old sentences.
Yeah.
What's
Like,
the name to
when
those
I said
books?
back then, yeah,
Dystopian,
ditto.
dystopian book?
Yeah.
1984 and Brave New World.
Oh, I stay.
Welcome. Thank you for reminding me to turn off the recording. See you later, Will. That's my kids, by the way, and my husband.